and I'm so excited to introduce that we have our first sponsor for this podcast, The Breastfeeding Shop, who we featured last episode, episode 37, talking about what can be covered with TRICARE. The Breastfeeding Shop is there for all your pregnancy and postpartum needs for what's covered under your insurance for military and TRICARE. And they have the largest variety of breast pumps in any breastfeeding store. They've got your compression socks, your compression belts, and they make it super simple. They've got sample prescriptions, so your physician doesn't even need to do any guesswork. And even more so, they will contact your physician for you to get that prescription if you already don't have one. So if you are pregnant or you know a future mama-to-be, it doesn't matter if they are in the US or internationally, the Breastfeeding Shop covers everyone. So go ahead and send them over to the Breastfeeding Shop and start your order today. Today, we're going to hear from a fellow military mom's birth experience that didn't go quite according to plan. She's here to share the obstacles she had to overcome both in labor and recovery so future moms won't have to. To tell her story, we have Cassie Pales of the U.S. Air Force joining us. Welcome, Cassie.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Well, first, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. Like I've said earlier on in the podcast, the best way to learn are through other people's birth experiences and stories, because you don't know what you don't know. So you have quite a few obstacles that we've discussed, and I can't wait for everyone to hear you. So what is your birth story?
So I think that, I guess the perspective I was going into the labor and delivery ward with was I'm a healthy, fit 27-year-old person. My mom had, really no complications in her 5 pregnancies. This is just going to be normal and fine. And I think that there's just not really any such thing as normal, but that's hard to wrap your head around when you're having your first kid. So there were some things ahead of time that I didn't really educate myself on. I knew that I really didn't want to have a C-section unless it was absolutely necessary, but I didn't know what some of the other processes were that could be sort of assisted births, like vacuum or forceps. And I didn't really educate myself too much on different types of tearing and what that meant for healing, mostly because tearing scared me. And I just figured if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and there's not going to be anything I can do about it. So I don't want to scare myself ahead of time. So I think I intentionally did not educate myself on that. And the doctor's appointments I had and the birth class that my husband and I went to didn't really touch on those types of things. It was more, what are the contractions going to be like and how many seconds apart and that type of thing. It didn't really talk about some of the alternative things that can happen. So I was 5 days overdue with my son when they induced me. So I went in at 8:00 at night on a Thursday for the induction. They started me onto Pitocin, and my son's heart rate kept dropping. Every time they increased the Pitocin drip, his heart rate would drop. So they were increasing it really, really gradually. And so all through the night on Thursday and the day on Friday, there wasn't really much happening. And finally, Friday evening, my contractions started to ramp up and actually got to a point where I felt comfortable saying, okay, probably time for the epidural. Let's get this thing moving. And I was dilating and all that stuff. So it seemed like things were progressing the way they were supposed to, at least, at that point. And so I got the epidural and thought, okay, well, that's it. Like, the worst is over. It's going to be smooth sailing after that. And right after I got the epidural, they said, okay, why don't you just roll over onto your left side and we'll see if that gets some things moving. And as soon as I did that, my son's heart rate just plummeted, and a whole bunch of nurses just burst into the room, and they were like, flip her over, put her on oxygen, stop the Pitocin drip, and they're all yelling. And so I'm panicked. My husband, who has absolutely no medical experience at all, reaches over before the nurses can even get there and flips me over. So I'm on my hands and knees, which I didn't even know was a position you could be in when you were in the middle of giving birth. They don't really show that on TV. It's always just somebody, lying on a bed with a sheet over their knees. There's no sheet. At least there wasn't for me. So I'm on my hands and knees, and they are like, okay, well, if you want, you could start pushing. Your 10 centimeters dilated. And I was like, let's do this. Let's get this going. This has been a long process. But I had an epidural, so I couldn't feel my legs, and I was trying to support myself on my knees, which was would have been comical if it wasn't such a scary moment. And eventually I was able to kind of reposition. My son's heart rate went back to normal, and I started pushing. But the issue was my son was turned to the left. So his head was down, but he was turned to the left side. And so they can't really come out that way. They can come up face up or face down, but not sideways. So the doctors went and reached up and tried to turn him 3 different times with their hands, and he just kept turning himself back. And all told, I ended up pushing for about 5 hours, even though nothing was really happening. He wasn't going to come out that way. At one point, the doctors left to go deliver somebody else's baby and then came back while I just kept pushing. And so it was tough mentally to be in that position where you're doing all this work and you basically know it's not going to come to anything. And so after all of that, the doctors came back in and they said, look, at this point, I think we need to intervene. We could go and do an emergency C-section right now. And I just felt like, oh my gosh, I just pushed for 5 hours. How, and then all that is for nothing. What are my other options? And so they said, okay, well, we can't do a vacuum because the baby's not crowning. So that's not really an option. And they were calling them surgical options. So when they first started talking about surgical options, all I thought was, okay, C-section. That was all I understood a surgical option to be. But they lumped the vacuum and the forceps into that. So they said, well, you could do a C-section or you could do forceps. And I didn't even know what a forceps delivery was. I just hadn't really heard about it. I hadn't done any research on it. And at the time, my baby's heart rate had been up and down and up and down. And I was so concerned about him that my only question to them was, okay, what are the risks to the baby? And they said, there aren't really any substantial risks. That he'll have some mild bruising on his face, but other than that, there's not really any risks to him. And I said, okay, well, then let's do that. And the doctor was like, you will have a more difficult recovery. But at the time, I had been in labor at that point for a day and a half and pushing for 5 hours. I was like, I don't even know what that means. But let's just do it. So they're like, okay, we're going to get ready. And there was only one moment in this whole experience where I was grateful that I was me and not my husband. And that was the moment that they picked the forceps up and I saw them, which sounds really weird, but I looked at them and they were these huge metal, scary salad tongue looking things. And I just thought, oh my God, I do not want to have to see what's about to happen. And I just squeezed my eyes shut. And so I pushed and they put the forceps up and grabbed my son's head with them and just started yanking. And initially there was a female resident who was doing it. And then the male attending had to step in because she didn't physically have the strength to pull him out with the forceps. And so my husband said it was like, he can't believe that they didn't pull the baby's head off the way it looks with them pulling so hard and you're pushing. And so my son was born, everything was okay. He did have some bruising and he had a little abrasion on his face. And he had some burst blood vessels in one of his eyes, but didn't end up having any vision problems or anything like that. So he ended up being perfectly healthy, which is really the most important thing. But, afterwards, it was such an out-of-body experience. He was born at 5:44 a.m. on a Saturday. And so they started stitching me up. And I could hear the attending teaching the resident how to put me back together. Like I could hear him say, oh, no, you have to stitch it this way because the posterior foreshed has to be over here. And I just was like, oh my gosh, I just don't want to be here. I ended up running into the attending the next day, I think, when I was walking around the maternity ward. And he looked at me with this look of like pity in his face and said, "You're going to have such a difficult recovery." And I was like, great. But it's, when it's your first kid, you don't know what that means. You don't know what a normal, quote unquote, normal recovery is, or typical. So I went home and was in a lot of pain, like just a lot of pain. I couldn't stand up for long periods of time, without being in significant pain. And that lasted for about 9 weeks for me. The pain did. And then there were just other things that were complicated. Going to the bathroom took forever because, you can't wipe anything. So you have to rinse things off. And there were some additional steps I had to do because of the severity of my tearing. I pretty much sat on an ice pack for like weeks straight. And none of that was stuff. That's just stuff people don't talk about because like it's gross and it's personal and it's TMI. And so I just had no idea whether what I was going through was what people, what normal people experience or what. I did make the mistake at one point of Googling my tear. So I had a 3C tear and I Googled it probably at about like the 10-day postpartum mark, which is right when your hormones all crash. And thankfully, one of my friends warned me about this before I had my son. But she basically said, 10 days to 2 weeks after, you might just start crying for no reason and just like cry all the time. And that definitely happened to me. And during one of those times, I Googled my type of tear. And of course, like the stories are just going to be the horror stories. Like, I was in pain for 7 years postpartum or whatever. So my husband like came into the room and found me just like uncontrollably crying that I was never going to be normal again. And he was like, okay, we need to put the Google down and move on here. But I think it was just, for me mentally, I felt like I was just living in this other body that like, I didn't know what it was doing. I had a lot of incontinence issues, both ends and like some trouble controlling flatulence and things like that. And so even though I started working out and I felt like I was in pretty decent shape when I went back to work, all things considered, doing group PT was still pretty hard because I was afraid that I was like not going to be able to control whether I peed my pants or whether, gas came out. And that's a really embarrassing position to be in with your coworkers. And I think that I just realized there are so many other things that moms go through when they're recovering that aren't just like, did you lose the baby weight? Did you get your body back? Physically, they might look to somebody like they are totally back to what they looked like before they had the baby, but so many other things could be different, what they're experiencing. And they're not really, a lot of times people are not going to talk about it. Like, I'm not going to feel totally comfortable telling my boss, like, hey, yeah, I'm having so many issues when I'm going to the bathroom that I went back to the doctor 5 months postpartum and was like, can you check whether everything's sewed up right? It's just like a hard thing to talk about. And I ended up going to physical therapy for probably like 6 months after, and that was huge. It just really helped. And it helped to have the physical therapist say, this isn't something you have to live with forever. Like, there are things you can do to strengthen those muscles or, help repair things. And you don't have to, at the age of 28, accept that you are never going to be able to hold your urine in when you run again.
Was it a pelvic floor physical therapist or a regular physical therapist?
Yes, it was a pelvic floor physical therapist, which I think is an important distinction. So she was awesome. And it's just nice to know that you're not, blowing things out of proportion. I think I'm somebody that, I've always thought I have a fairly high pain tolerance and that type of thing. And I think, you're like, oh, well, maybe this is just what everybody goes through and it's normal. Or people will say, moms will say things like, oh yeah, you'll never be able to jump on a trampoline again without peeing yourself or something like that. And I just like was not ready to accept that that was going to be my new normal. So, so those are some of the things that I encountered during birth and some of the postpartum issues I had.
Yeah, so for the audience, so now forceps aren't, and we talked about this before, they really aren't used quite often. And we won't name location, but you were at a military hospital. So I don't know if that
Yes.
played a role into it. But from my experience, yes, they are not very commonly used. How big are they? Like estimated inches wise? Because you said salad tongs. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not that bad.
Yeah. I think that lengthwise, they're probably at least as long as a ruler, at least a foot long. And then the actual, like, it almost looks like a shallow spoon, um, with like, that's hollow, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And so
So
like it's slightly curved.
yeah, because you said you
And
tore. So did you tear because they were so big, or did you tear just because he was hard to get out?
I it's hard to say, I guess. But I think from what I know about forceps now, it's much more common to tear with them because I guess if you think about it, that's two extra things that are in there and then pulling the head and shoulders out, uh, all kind of at once. And so I, I kind of felt like my body was just resisting the whole process the whole time, which is something that took me a while to accept. You know, like, why didn't my body just go into labor like it was supposed to? Why didn't my body just, why didn't the baby turn, that type of thing. So it's hard to say. And I don't know if it has anything to do either with the way the whole thing went. And like my body not really choosing to go into labor, but sort of being forced to as well.
Yeah, there's so many different reasons, and that's one of the most common things I hear is, especially for first-time moms, because we don't know. You just have these expectations, and when they don't happen, you think you're a failure, your body didn't work the way it should, but there's, your bones could have been positioned wrong, or just how you were laying on the bed, or like, your baby was turned. It's just, it could not even have been your fault, right? It's just how things work out sometimes and how there's spacing because there's not that much space in there. Now,
Right.
so you tore, so 3C tearing, for those of you that don't know, that are becoming a mom, we're not going to scare you, but a 3C tear is almost all the way from your vagina to your rectum. So I actually didn't know you could have incontinence of your bowels. So how long did that work? Like, how long did that go for you?
Um, it was a process sort of. So one of the things that I left you leave the hospital with a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like 800 milligram tablets of ibuprofen, and then stool softeners. They give you a couple different types of stool softeners. And I used those for several weeks. And then like nobody told me, okay, you should use this for X amount of time. And so I kind of thought like, okay, maybe I should start to wean myself off of these. That was a huge mistake. um, I think that was probably at like 4 weeks postpartum, maybe. And I had a lot of stitches. And then that was something they were going to check at 6 weeks postpartum. And I'm fairly certain that I popped a stitch at one point during this time frame when I thought maybe it was time to stop using the stool softeners, and it was not time. That bowel movements became incredibly painful to the point where I would go to the farthest bathroom in the house if there were other people there because I was afraid I was going to like scream. It was so painful. And, I just didn't know if that was normal, but it didn't seem normal. And my son was born in November, and I was about to go to my in-laws for Christmas. And I started bleeding at one point. So I actually went back a little bit before 6 weeks to have them check me before I left for my in-laws because I didn't want to be out of the area and still have complications. And they were like, oh no, you really need to keep taking your stool softeners. And they said everything looked okay. But after that, when I ran, it was more frequently that I would have urinary incontinence. And I'm talking like, not just like, oh, I peed myself a little. I'm talking total bladder voidage when I stopped running. Like, and there was no time to get to the bathroom. I'd like be in my driveway and it was just, so that lasted for maybe I don't know, maybe like 4 months postpartum for me. And then going to the physical therapist really helped with that piece. Um, the and then the bowel incontinence was hit or miss. I would try to time working out or something that was going to be harder with something like that to be after, when I knew I didn't have to go. But there were times when it was like, I have to run to the bathroom right this very second. I do not have time I cannot hold anything. I have to go right now. So there was an urgency piece to it too. There was one time that I was at group PT that was more than 6 months postpartum, I think, that after a particularly hard workout, I went to the bathroom and I had some bowel incontinence and was like mortified. Not that anybody else would know, but I knew, I was an adult woman that had that happen. So it was kind of a stages, and I have not had an issue with that for the last, whatever it's been, year and a half. My son's like 2 and 4 months now.
So now what was your timeline to recover? Because you're talking about working out. So I'm like, oh my God, did you work out at 9 weeks or did you work out 6 months? When was that timeline like?
I started doing some workouts before I came back from maternity leave, and mostly things like squats. I would do some, like beach body video type workouts because I could with the baby right there, didn't have to leave the house. I've been a runner since I was a freshman in high school, and it's a really important part of my life. And that, I think I started doing that probably like 3 months, like after I went back to work, 3 months postpartum, maybe. And it was certain things were very painful, and there were certain things I just couldn't do. If as a unit we were doing jumping jacks, I won't do jumping jacks anymore. I just don't do them. So certain activities were harder than others.
I'm laughing over here because I'm only 9 months postpartum, and yeah, there's no jumping jacks right now.
No. My physical therapist said there's no reason you should ever do a jumping jack. It's just not worth it.
And it's so funny. The more that you hear birth stories, when you are a first-time mom, I see so much on the forum saying, hey, just like you said, my mom bounced back. She fit into her clothes right away. So I'm going to sign up for this training. I'm going to go, I plan on running this half marathon so many months after. Like, you don't know what your birth experience is going to be like. And do not set yourself up for don't set yourself up for failure. Just go with it. So if you can't, run at 6 weeks, I've seen some girls go and be like, yeah, I need to run 5 miles at 6 weeks. I'm like, oh my God, I was still just like you. I was sitting down, making sure, my stitches were good. And you just don't understand that. So having those expectations up front can really set you up for success. So how did that
absolutely
feel? Yeah. How was that getting back into your own body? So that recovery phase.
Honestly, it was as mental as it was physical for a lot of the reasons you just talked about. I mean, I have been an athlete, and it's part of my identity. I'm an athlete. I'm a runner, generally physically fit. My expectations are lower right now as I'm kind of in the middle of having kids. I'm pregnant with my second right now. So I kind of figure like I'll give myself some grace while I'm in the middle of having kids. And then once I'm done, maybe start training for something. And that's just the way that I need to do it because it is such a part of my identity. I want to be able to do it the way I know how I can do it, or as fast as I know I can do it, or, push myself. And it was such a weird mental place to be in, to be working out. And part of doing that in a smart way was not pushing myself on certain things, or certain types of pain are not good pain when you're recovering. And you have to just mentally get yourself in that place where like, okay, I'm going to do what I can to be fit. But if I'm going to just prolong my recovery or like injure myself doing this, it's not going to be a good thing. So I think having the right types of expectations was important. And also for me, it was just such a mental journey, understanding that my body was not going to go back. like I have stretch marks and my belly skin is never going to look like it did before I had my son. Um, and other parts of my body are not really the same either. So, you know, that for me was hard to accept, and I felt a little guilty about that because I don't consider myself to be a particularly, like vain or materialistic person, but it mattered to me that my body was just like not the body that I had been in for most of my life, physically and visibly. And so that was just a tough mental hurdle, I think, to just accept like your body's going to change as you age, your body's going to change as you have kids, and it's okay. And it doesn't mean you should just like give up on your fitness or anything like that, but you should just have different expectations for it.
So now you're on your second pregnancy. Did the
Yes.
first one affect this one? And how are you prepping differently for the second one now that you know there's other options?
Yeah. So one of the first things I talked to my doctor about, we're at a different duty station now, and where we are right now does not have a large military hospital. So I'm seeing a civilian provider off base. And one of the first things I talked to him about was my birth experience and my recovery experience. He told me he does not do forceps deliveries. He said, he's not in a position where he needs to be learning how different types of deliveries work. And so it's just something that in his experience is usually more harm than good. So he doesn't do them. So he said, I will not be delivering that way again. And I don't think I would be electing to anyway. But I'm still not sure actually whether I'm going to have an elective C-section this time. My doctor is open to it, but he wants to see my medical records to see whether he strongly recommends that instead of a vaginal delivery. And that mentally is hard too. I feel like my first delivery did not go the way I had pictured. You picture going into labor and going to the hospital and pushing and having the baby come out. And that didn't happen for me the first time. And I kind of want to have an experience that's like that. But I also don't want to be incontinent for the rest of my life in any way. So if my doctor reviews my records and says, hey, I think this is going to be too much risk of permanent incontinence, then I will do a C-section because it's just not worth it.
Yep. And there's always risk associated. So I don't know if you've listened to episode 6 yet for her VBAC experience, because she had cesarean first. But VBACs are an option, but you have to know your risk and you have to be okay with that. Right.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. So what do you recommend for everyone going forward for their first pregnancy or second? What should they know? And what do you recommend from your experience?
I think some level of self-education on certain things that can happen is important. I didn't want to scare myself, and I don't want to scare other people by sharing my experience that, theirs is going to be totally different than mine. But at the same time, it would have probably been beneficial to me to understand what different types of tears were, what types of tears forceps could cause before making that decision after, 36 hours of labor and being delirious and, not really being in a great position to be making a measured decision. So I think a little bit more self-education than I did is probably a good idea. And then I think talking to other moms after you have a baby about what you're experiencing, because that for me was so helpful to understand that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person who's ever gone through this, and that it wasn't completely abnormal, and that there were things I could do about it. Also, I cannot stress enough, ask for a referral for a pelvic floor physical therapist if you are having any pain or issues, because it is so helpful.
Yes. And it is covered by TRICARE for everyone listening. So
Yes, it is.
all right. So thank you so much, Cassie. I really appreciate, just like you said, the only way to learn is from listening to birth stories, and yours is definitely unique and opens up the option of what could happen. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's nice to be able to share and talk about.